object-oriented programming and go into constructors, methods, and then also yes. So day 4, we're gonna just go over mostly everything, not everything, but like the basics on object-oriented programming and go into constructors, methods, and then also parameters and arguments and what's the difference between primitive and reference variables. So last meeting, I went over like the very, very basics of object-oriented programming, but I'm just gonna go over those basics again. And so I'm going to use an example of a phone. I'm going to create a phone class, okay? And in this phone class, there will be different objects. You can have like a Samsung phone, an iPhone, you can have a Huawei, you can have a OnePlus phone. You have these different types of phones. And these are all objects under the same class type, and the class type is phone. So I'll just put some definitions here. So like an object is basically a container that consists of both properties and methods or functions, basically. And they are all connected in some way. So you have like a Samsung phone, an iPhone. These are all phones that have properties. You have properties like the display size, the pixel density, the battery capacity, and then you have methods and functions that each one of these objects can perform, like turning on or swiping to the right or to the left. And these are all connected in some way. They're all of the class type phone. So that's what an object is. And what a class is, it's a blueprint, basically, that holds these methods and properties and allows you to create instances or copies of objects. So copies of objects, which is basically instances, basically means like of this class type, I can create different copies. I can create a Samsung phone, iPhone, OnePlus. I can create these different copies. And properties, when I say properties, I mean like variables or features, which describe the object. And when I talk about methods, I'm basically talking about, I'll go over this, but like functions or blocks of code you can invoke. So I'll go over these in detail. So that's basically the very, very basics of object-oriented programming. So you have objects, which is like basically things you can think of it as something that you can like describe. It has a property and a method, properties and functions, and they're all connected in some way. So I will basically create some properties. So I'm going to use an example for a phone. So I'm going to open these two phones. I'm going to see some examples. So these are different properties you can use. So you can use the RAM size. So I'll use that. So int RAM. So that's a property. Let's see. We could do display. We'll make it a double display size. We could do storage. Int storage. We'll do string name of phone. And then we could do Boolean has headphone jack. Because yes, it either has a headphone jack, true or false. Okay. So these are properties that describe each one of these objects, okay? And then you could have methods. And I'll go over that when we talk about methods specifically. So this is a class with these properties, and you can create instances of objects. So I'll create in this other class, I'll declare the main method. Right, and so to create a phone object, so to create a new phone, basically, you would have to do something like new phone, right? And this basically saves a new copy of this object in the phone value, and this creates a new object in the storage, and it has the type phone. And these parentheses, I'll go over what these means, but this parentheses basically um, invokes a default constructor, and I'll go over what constructors are. And here we created the object, but we have to store it in a reference variable that we can use in access. So to do that, like, similar for primitive variables, we do like something like int x or string y, right? So here, to store this object, we have to create a reference variable, and the type will be phone, and we can create a reference variable. We'll use the iPhone 8. iPhone 8 equals new phone and these parentheses. So this is basically a reference variable with the type phone, and you're storing this new object in that reference variable. And you can create different instances. You can create many copies. You can create phone, and we'll do Galaxy S9 equals new phone. And then you can create another phone. You can do another iPhone. You can do phone, iPhone 11 equals new phone, right? So here I'm creating different copies, different instances of this type phone and saving an object to it. And each one of these properties can describe these different objects. So that's basically the basics of object-oriented programming. So now I'm going to go over constructors. So does everyone get like the basics of object-oriented programming and how it works, kind of? Like what's an object, basically? Okay, so I'm going to go over constructors. So when you create these reference variables, right? When you create these objects and you want to set values to these variables. So if you didn't know about constructors, which right now you guys don't, you would have to do something like iPhone 8 dot, and then you have these different values, display size equals, what is it, 5.5, right? 5.5. And then you have to do something like iPhone 8 dot has headphone jack is equal to false. Or iPhone 8 dot RAM is equal to 3. iPhone 8 dot name of phone is equal to iPhone 8. We'll just do that. So these are the different properties that describe this object. And whenever you create an instance, so Galaxy S9, iPhone 11, you'd have to, do it for each, and it's just tedious like this. Let's say, okay, I'll just put random values. Okay, 6.2. Say this is 8, false, and Galaxy S9, and then we'll just keep it like that. So so each time you declare an instance, if you didn't know about constructors, you would have to constantly do these to set the values, and that's just a lot of work. So you can basically, yeah.
Wait, so we had 3 different objects with different characteristics with the so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
So constructors allow you to do this whole thing in one line, basically. So, constructor, I'll just type out the definition of constructor. Or here, I'll create a constructor. So a constructor is basically a special method that allows you to initialize uh, you to initialize the object when the object is first created, and it is typically used to set values to the properties of an object. So to create a constructor, you just use the name. So you do public because you have to access it from a different class. I'll go over what public private means later. You do public, and then you do the name of the class, phone, parentheses here. So this right here is called a default constructor, and it's basically, so here, these parentheses, what I'm doing here is I'm calling this default constructor. So people usually use default constructors to set, default values that will be true for all the objects. So let's say in this default constructor, I do something like initializing the object, right? So in this default constructor, which is like a special method, once you make this new instance, it's going to invoke this constructor. And yeah, I'll run it. Initializing the object is, so every time I created a new object, it's invoking this default constructor here. It's the first thing, it's a special method, and it's the first thing that runs when you first create the object. So if I do anything in here, it'll basically execute these instructions when you first initialize this object. So that's what a default constructor is, and you usually do it to set default values or perform default instructions. So now I'll create another constructor, public phone. And in this constructor, I will have a few parameters, okay? I'm gonna, here I'll explain, so let me first do it. So int in RAM double in display size, int in storage, string in name of phone, boolean in has headphone jack. Okay. So here's another constructor. This is a default constructor because there's no parameters. So here's another constructor, and here I have a bunch of parameters. So when I create this object, instead of doing all this, I can pass in these values. So you have to see what's first. So it's RAM display size. So I can pass in the RAM. I can pass in 3. I can do comma, pass in the display size, 5.5. See what's next. Storage. Um, storage. Let's just say 500. Storage in name of phone, so you can pass in iPhone 8. And has headphone jack, which is false. Okay. So we can delete this, or we'll just comment this out. Okay, so here I create a new object called iPhone 8. And once I create this object, I invoke this constructor that I made and I pass in these values, right? If I go here, these are parameters and it's getting the values from when we create this constructor. So if we go back to the definition of a constructor, a special method that allows you to initialize the object when the object is first created. So when you first create this object, I pass in these values and now I will set them. I can do RAM is equal to inram. Um, display size is equal to in display size. So here I'm setting these values, which I declared here, to the values that we passed in when we first declared the object. So that's what I'm doing here is similar to what I was doing here, right? So these special properties which have unique values based on your object, I'm declaring those values in the default constructor when I first passed in these values from when I first created the object. So I'll finish all the storage is equal to in storage, name of phone is equal to in name of phone, has headphone jack is equal to in has headphone jack. Okay, right. So yeah. And now if I, print something out like, let me comment these other ones. So now if I print something out like iPhone 8 dot, will print out the display size. If I print that out, it's 5.5. Because here, when we first created this object iPhone 8, I passed in this 5.5, and I passed in this 3, the 500, and when you declare the object, it goes to the constructor here. It doesn't go to the default constructor because we made an object that passes in these specific values, so it'll access this constructor, and it will, set the value of that, display size, the 5.5, which we sent in. It'll set that to the property here that we declared, the display size. The display size is equal to in display size, which I declared here. And when we access it, when we do iPhone 8 dot, we use that dot operator, display size, it'll access that value that we set here, and it's 5.5. So does that make sense? What a constructor is basically? Okay. Let's see. So
I have a question.
yeah.
Why are you? I don't know how the compiling thing works, but aren't there two different, like, documents or whatever?
Oh, like here and here?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, when I compile it, when I press run, it'll first go to the main method because that's the special method that runs first. And because this class is public and these constructors are public, I can access it from this class. So I'll go over
Okay.
access modifiers later, like public, private, static,
Yeah.
what all these mean. But yeah, these are two different, classes. Sure, you can call them documents. And in this class, I'm creating different instances of this class, this phone class.
Okay.
So yeah, I'll go over how exactly that works later when I go over access modifiers on Friday. Okay. Yeah, so does everyone get how a constructor works? It's the first thing that gets accessed. It's a special method, and it's the first thing that gets invoked when you first create the object. So I was able to do all of this in a special method here. So now whenever I create other instances of objects, like here, I can just pass in values like 4, 6.7, 400, Galaxy S9, false. So I just created another instance of the class phone, and I passed in these values, and it'll go to this constructor, and it'll set those properties to those values, and you can access it. So that's what a constructor is basically. It's pretty important. You'll always use constructors. Yeah. So when you initially create your object, the constructors allow you to like just construct your object. So now I'll go over a keyword called this. So here, if you noticed, I had to create variable names that were different than these variable names here of these properties. Because if I made it the same name, like RAM display size, storage, name of phone, has headphone jack, right? If I declared it like that, oh wait, and then I set it like this, right? RAM display size, storage, name of phone, has headphone jack. So if I did it like that, when the compiler runs, it's not going to know if you're trying to access these properties or these values that you passed in. And that'll be a problem. So it won't be able to run. And so to solve that, and you can just use something like in or make these different values, but it's just kind of dumb to like just create new names for these parameters, and it'll just be better and easier to use the same variable name. But now the computer doesn't know if we're talking about the object properties here or if we're talking about the parameters of the constructor with the values sent when we initialize the object. So to solve that, we use a keyword called this. So this dot, this dot, this dot. And what this does is this basically tells the compiler which variable you're talking about. And you're talking about these variables here. And it's similar to something where here we would do like iPhone 8 dot display size or has headphone jack or name of phone. It would be similar to something like that. It would be similar to like iPhone 8 dot storage or something. You can replace this basically theoretically, if you're speaking, you could replace this with the object. But this basically tells the compiler you're accessing the current variable of the object. You're accessing. So this tells. So this keyword tells the compiler you are accessing the object properties. Right. So yeah. So by using this keyword, we are talking about these values here. See, if I like double click here, it highlights, that value here. If I double click this, it's talking about this value that we passed in. So this keyword allows you to tell the compiler that you're accessing these variables, not these variables. And then you can now use the same name. You can use the same name, and you won't, get confused, and it won't be, bad. Yeah, or you can just use, different variables. You can say like in RAM or something like that, but I prefer to do this. Yeah, so that's what this keyword does. Yeah, okay, so now what were we gonna do next? Methods, okay. So that's the constructor. Okay. So methods. Okay. So I typed up the definition of a method, but I'll give you a better definition. So a method is basically a function or a block of code which can be invoked and can be executed whenever and wherever. You'll get what that means when I tell you what a method is. So when we did this whole system dot out dot print line, right? Print line is a method, and it is a block of code which you can execute whenever you want and wherever you want. So if I do something here, I can actually show you here. This is a method, right? So when we're doing this, it's accessing this method, it's calling this method, it's invoking this method, and we're sending in a value, string x. This is a parameter, see string x. We're sending this value mean into this method. So print line is a method. It's basically a block of code which you can access, which you can invoke, right? And you can invoke it how many times you want. It doesn't matter. So you can invoke it how many times you want at this print line method. Instead of having to, write all this stuff every time you want to print out to the screen, you can just access this method and you send in this argument, and it sets this parameter equal to that, and it runs. So to create a method, so usually you would create methods of classes. So I can create different methods, right? I can create a method called void print display size, right? And I'll explain to you what void means when I talk about return statements, but void means that it's just void. It's not expecting the method to return anything. So yes. So I'll just do something. I'll just say the display size of this phone is display size, right? Okay. So here I created a method, and to create a method, you have to first specify your return type. And right now, when we invoke this method, I'll show you how to invoke a method. It's not expecting anything in return. It's going to be a void method. It's going to just do this block of code and just come back. And you have to make a name for your method so that you can access it. Yes. So if I go here and if I do something like iPhone 8 dot, what was the method called? Print display size. Print display size. It will, if we run this, it'll print the display size. Let me comment this out. So that's what a method is. So using this object we created, we used the dot operator and we invoked this method called print display size. And it went here and it called this method print display size and it executed this code. So that's what a method is basically. So yeah, and whenever you create a method, you first have to specify what's going to return. So once this method is done running, it returns void, and this will just become void. This will be nothing. Void means empty. And because sometimes you'll ask the method to return something. You can return an integer string, and this invocation will basically be that value you return, and I'll go over that. So void means that you're not going to be returning anything, and when the place where we invoke that method, it's not going to expect anything in return. And so after you do void, you have to make your you have to specify the name of your method so we can invoke it, so we can access it. Yeah. So now I'm going to do other methods. Okay, I'm gonna go over. I'm just gonna do more examples. Okay. Let's say I make a method called void checkout details. And in this, I declare a few parameters. I say string customer name, string date, and that's it, right? And then you could print out customer name bought. We can use name a phone, which we made up here. Name a phone. Button on date. Okay, so we can declare this iPhone 8 dot checkout details, right? And if we just do this, it'll give you an error because it's expecting some arguments. It's expecting some arguments to set to these parameters. So what a parameter is basically these right here. So these temporary variables that you send in when you invoke the method. So parameters are basically temporary variables, which you can only use in these curly braces. That's what I mean by temporary. So meaning I can't access these variables like in this method or somewhere else. So, and these right here are arguments. So I'll send in, what do I need to send in? The customer name. So I'll just say Bob. And the date can be 4/19, right? So here, using that object we made, I'm invoking this method called checkout details, and I'm sending in Bob and the date 4/19. I'm sending in these arguments. These are arguments. And these parameters will get those arguments and set those values to these two variable names, and it'll perform this instruction, basically. So yes, so that's a method, basically. And I'll give you a definition of parameter. So a parameter is a temporary variable in the parentheses of a method that can only be used in that method, and it expects values from the arguments sent by the invocation. So what I mean by expects values from the arguments sent by the invocation, here we're invoking that method, and here you're sending something called arguments, which are values you send to the method with, yeah, the values you send to the method. So those are arguments, and these are parameters. So does that make sense? Does anyone have questions about that? I'll give more examples right now. Let's see. So let's say so now I'll go over return statements. So sometimes, or most of the time actually, when you invoke this method, right, it's going to expect some value in return, right? So let's say, so remember I said when you declare your method, you have to first specify your return type, right? Return type, and then you have to specify the name of your method. So I'm going to specify my return type. Let's say I want to return a string, right? String get information, and we will pass in we won't pass in anything. So string get information. As you can see, there's an error because this method must return a result of type string. So it's expecting a return of some string, right? Now there's no error. So we'll just do something. We'll say return, and we'll just send in information. We'll send in, send in information. And you just send in like, the RAM plus the display size plus the, I don't know, storage, something like that, right? So return that string. And here, when you invoke that method, you do like iPhone 8 dot get information, right? When you invoke this method, it's going to return this type. So once this method is done running, it's going to make this invocation equal to that value. So what people usually do is they set a variable equal to it. They can say string information is equal to that, right? And then you can print out information. And if you run this, it'll print out information and just some random stuff that we did. Because we didn't add spaces, it doesn't make sense, but that's fine. So yeah, so we declare this new variable, and we set it equal to the value that we get in return when we invoke this method. So we invoke this method using the object, and then we say dot get information, and we don't need to send in any arguments because there's no parameters here. And when it runs this method, it will return this value, this string value. It'll return this value, and here, once it's done running, it'll set this value, it'll set this invocation equal to that value. So now once this is done running, this right here is equal to this, and then you set this new variable you created information equal to the value you got from this method, and now you can just print out that method or print out that value. So you can also just you can do this, right? And you can just do that, right? You can also just do this. So once you're done running, it'll set this invocation equal to what you returned in that method, and it'll just print it out. So yeah, so that's what return does. So when you create your method, so to create a method, first specify a return type, which can be void if you are not returning anything, or it can be any data type like int, string, double, and you can also return objects, which we'll go over later. And the next thing you do is you create a name for the method so you can invoke it. And the third thing you do is specify any parameters that will get values from the arguments sent once invoked, if needed. So you don't need parameters. We didn't use any parameters here. So that's basically the steps to create a method. And also a step before this is you would have to use an access modifier like private, public, stat. You have to use those types. And I'll go over that Friday. But just know for now, to create a method, you need to specify a return type, and you specify the name of the method, and then if you need any parameters, which we did here, you specify that. And to invoke that method, you would just, use that object, use the dot operator, and invoke that method. And send in any arguments if that method has parameters. Okay, so does that make sense what a method is, essentially? Let's see. So, I think that's, what else do we want to, does anyone have any questions on methods? I'm going to give you another example, which is probably better. Let's say I create a new class. Okay. And I call this class like math class. Right. We can have our, properties. We can have our constructor. And it could be something like int x, int y, and then this dot x is equal to x. This dot y is equal to y. Okay, so now I will have some methods. I'm just going to go over methods more. So let's say I have a method called add. Let's create an add method. So let's say I want to return an integer, right? Int. So you declare your return type int add, and then you send in values like int a, int b, and it'll basically return. So you can see there's an error right now because it's expecting a return of type int. So you do return a plus b. So when we, in this place, we can create a new instance, math class x equals new math class, and it will invoke that undefined. Oh, public math class. Okay. Okay. So we created a new object, right? And then we can do x dot, add, and send in two values we want to add. Let's say we want to add 7 and 6, right? And we can set a new int result is equal to x dot add 7 and 6. And you are going to expect a value of 13 because using this object you created, you access this method called add, and you send in these arguments 7 and 6. It sets it equal to these parameters int a, int b, and it returns a and b. It returns these values. It adds it and returns that as an integer type. You go here, and it'll set result equal to that value, because once you're done once the method is done running, it'll set this invocation equal to the return type, and it'll set result equal to that return type, which is 13, and you can just print out that result, and it'll be 13. So that's probably a better example, so you can understand methods easier, and arguments and parameters. So you're sending these arguments, and here for these parameters, it will set those parameters equal to that, and then it returns a plus b as an integer type, and yeah, and wait, no, that not there, and then yeah, and it does that. So does that make sense? Any questions? We went over a lot today. I'll go over these two things on Wednesday. You guys already know this, but just to give you a better idea, I'll go into that in detail. But yeah, so we went over all of this today.